Hi, welcome to the first of the 3 lectures we're going to be looking at together this week. The first one, lecture 1, is called Abstraction and Sexuality, Yayoi Kusama, Louise Bourgeois and Eva Hesse. Although we're not going to look at them in that order, we're going to begin by looking in particular at the work of the older artist of the trio, Louise Bourgeois. But before we start to discuss the slides in any detail, I want to just give you an example of some key works by these artists we're going to be looking at today, but also to introduce this block of lectures more generally. So the aims and objectives of the next 3 lectures are to think about how we might develop a particular art historical vocabulary for talking about works of art that are insistently abstract, that don't seem to figure subject matter that we might readily identify in the world, but at the same time they seem to be somehow bodily, erotic, even violent. And it's important to think about how artists negotiate between figuring the world and doing so through unfamiliar and abstract means. So the course is not going to take us through an in-depth chronology of art in America since 1960, which is my particular area of specialism and which I'm going to be introducing to you today, but to light upon particular moments where a certain set of critical terms, a certain set of questions emerged and around which there's been much art historical attention. And I think that in a way what we want to be doing is finishing this block of lectures with a sense of some of the key issues, themes, terms and critical landscape that formed around a certain set of practices by artists from 1960 through to the present moment in contemporary art. Today we look at the work of Kusama, Hesse and Bourgeois, who were a trio of very important sculptors who were active in New York City in the 1960s, which was really one of the most significant periods of artistic practice in the 20th century. The impact of the art made in this decade continues to be felt upon much contemporary art, and after these 3 lectures that focus around the 1960s into the early 1970s, you'll have developed a way of thinking, talking, looking and writing about art of this period that continues to be very relevant and useful for how we talk about much contemporary practice. And in a way it provides you with a toolkit to think about art being made today, much of which draws either explicitly or implicitly on the kinds of formal and critical interventions that happened in the 1960s. We'll focus in particular on the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama's abstract-erotic soft sculpture from the early 1960s, and you see at top right here her wonderful reclaimed armchair, which she's covered with white painted soft stuffed tubers. We'll also look at the French-American artist Louise Bourgeois' psychologically charged sculpture and drawings, and you see one of her soft landscape latex works from 1963 on the current slide. And we'll also look at the German-born American artist Eva Hesse's eccentric erotic sculpture and drawings. What unites these 3 women is the fact that each was interested in thinking about the body and raising questions about sexuality in their work, and the presence and, importantly, the absence of the body. They each worked in an abstract mode, and I think that's clear from the 3 surprising and I think quite fascinating sculptural objects you're looking at here on this slide. They each worked in New York in the mid-60s in an abstract mode. They each used contemporary materials that sought in some way to disrupt the logic of contemporary sculptural practice at that time, such as minimalism, and here are 2 classic examples of 1960s minimalist art against which the works by Hesse, Kusama and Bourgeois can be understood as somehow pushing against or placing under pressure. You see in these works here made from, on the left, Sol LeWitt's plywood modular structure, which is painted in a pale grey. You can't see that, this is a black and white slide. And then to the right, Carl André's lever, which is a row of ordinary house bricks which have been lined up one after the other, protruding from the wall. The minimalists were interested in exploring the use of hard geometric forms and materials, and questions of repetition. What does it mean to repeat the same form over and over again? Now, certainly Kusama, Hesse and Bourgeois were interested in similar themes to do with repetition, but they veered more on the side of absurdity and a kind of playfulness. They were interested in the formal, but also, importantly, the psychologically charged associations of their work with the body. Again, its presence as much as its absence, and themes of sexuality that begin to emerge in their soft sculptural forms. And it's these themes of sexuality and identity, particularly in relation to questions of gender as well as race, that are going to be a constant across a number of these lectures. And I'm going to introduce you to the work of each of these three artists, but we'll have a brief introduction starting with Bourgeois, the oldest of the group. We'll then look at Kusama, and finally Eva Hesse. And as well as attending to the material aspects of their work, we're going to think about the roles abstraction and sexuality play in how we might look at, write about, and encounter these works. For these artists, we're concerned with challenging the status quo, with challenging the past and its authority at the level of form, materials, and so on, as well as theoretically, which is to say, in terms of how we talk about and conceptualise the work of art. These were not artists interested in picking up where others had perhaps left off. They weren't interested in fitting neatly into a familiar art historical canon or trajectory. They fundamentally disrupted really what we think of as sculpture. And I think the very fact that all three of them at various points were interested in soft, squashy, malleable forms speaks to something of this challenge that they were so committed to performing. We're looking here at a very famous slide from this period. This is a black and white photograph. It's an installation view of the Eccentric Abstraction exhibition, which opened at the Fishback Gallery in 1966. So Bourgeois and Hesse were included in this very small exhibition, and it was curated by the art historian and curator. This was her first exhibition, Lucy R. Lippard. She's a very, very well-regarded critic and curator of art from this period. Now, she curated the exhibition as a kind of riposte to another show that opened the same day in the same building, in fact, because in New York, many of the galleries are not as they are perhaps in London, where you would walk in from the street into the gallery space. They're in large buildings and you would go in and galleries would occupy individual floors. So in the same building and opening on the same day was an exhibition of minimalist sculpture, much like the work we just looked at by Sol LeWitt and Carl André. And Lippard very much imagined eccentric abstraction as a challenge or a playful riposte to the hard, clean-edged forms and geometry of the minimalists. Yayoi Kusama was discussed in the essay which Lippard wrote to accompany her exhibition. She was discussed as another example of the eccentric abstraction artists that she was thinking about in this show. But what we're looking at here in the foreground is a leather and wood moulded form that sits on the floor. That's by the sculptor Don Potts. There's another work by him in the background. Hanging from the left are some fabric and cloth and latex forms. That's by Frank Lincoln Viner. To the left, you can just see a transparent triangle poking into the edge of the image. This is part of a large inflatable pyramid form by Keith Sonnier. Now, this work had a motor, and so when it was turned on, air would be breathed in and out, so it looked as though it was pulsing or breathing on its own. So it's a very stark minimalist form, but it also at the same time is very bodily, as it looks like it's inhaling and exhaling. On the back wall, you see those long sausagey forms hanging down. That is a sculpture by Eva Hesse. They are a series of long papier-mâché sort of long fingers that are suspended from a nail, and they hang in a cluster against the wall. And to the side of that is a three-part work. It's 3 squares of board that have been pinned to the wall, and across them are a series of cotton wires. And what Eva Hesse has done is threaded them between the one in the middle and the one at the far end. So there's like a wavy tangle of wires connecting these austere minimalist forms. Now, the art world of New York in the 60s is typically defined in relation to minimalism. The cool white cubes, the serial structures, the working drawings, the removal of any evidence of the artist's hand, they really dominated later accounts of what the 60s art world was. However, just on the cusp of that minimal explosion, Lippard's show opened, and it included many artists who were to become, or who were already, emerging as important sculptors in their own right, known for the idiosyncratic appearance of their forms, yet united in their joint exploration of unusual materials, sensuous erotic forms, soft edges, chaotic tangles, and those limp wall pieces we've just looked at. For Lippard, eccentric abstraction was not the opposite of minimalism, but it was intimately connected to it. She was friends with many minimalist artists, including Lewitt and Carl Andre, and she was actually very interested in minimalism. This was not a rejection or straightforward critique of minimalist sculpture, but an attempt to rethink the boundaries of the minimal structure, to ask what happens when another artist takes minimalism's basic formats, the stack, the floor piece, the serially repeated form, monochrome colours, and industrial or non-art materials, and comes up with something that's in fact formally rather different. The remit of eccentric abstraction was to counter the prevalent minimal or structural idiom currently dominating the New York art scene, with less hard-edged sculptures that, in Lippard's words, refused to eschew imagination and the extension of sensuous experience, while at the same time refusing to sacrifice the solid formal basis of minimalism. What Lippard recognised as the sensuous, erotic, less hard-edged aspect of the new sculpture that she claimed was like the flip side or softer, less rigid aspect to minimalism, was the kind of abstract elements of the body and its traces that she perceived in the soft undulating forms, the breathing sculptures, the ways in which they refused to conform to the kind of structural geometric idiom of the minimalist structure. And in fact, questions of the body and anthropomorphism were central to debates around art in the 60s, in which the question of anthropomorphism, this is a term that describes something in bodily terms, even when it's entirely abstract. So this is a point when anthropomorphism became a loaded and ubiquitous term that Bryony Fair explains in the essay you'll have looked at on the reading list. It was a term that veered from something very good to something very bad. Depending on your critical interest, you either thought a work of art that invoked the body through abstract terms was a success, or you considered it a failing, that you'd somehow not managed to get rid of references to the body through a form of pure abstraction. And I think what's clear in the work we're looking at today is that Hesse, Kusama and Bourgeois were absolutely interested in the slippage between the anthropomorphic, the body, figuring and disappearing from their work in complex and rather surprising ways. In relation to Kusama's work, we're going to see how it became exaggerated to an intensely engaging level, while for Hesse it remained purely at the level of the abstract. And I also think that humour is an important aspect to these works that we need to think about too. Now, by saying there's a humorous aspect to the eccentric abstraction, artists is not to somehow diminish their successes as somehow less serious, but to allude to the ways in which these artists engaged deliberately with a witty, deflating set of gestures that really sought to prick the pomposity of the industrial, hard-edged angles of minimalism, to remind us that the body is never far away, even at its most abstract, silly, soft, and even sexy. First, I want to introduce Louise Bourgeois, and we're looking at a series of her very important early femme maison works on the slide here. Louise Bourgeois was a French-American artist. She worked in France, and it was there she met her husband, the art historian and American curator Robert Goldwater. He was in Paris researching his PhD dissertation at the time. She and he moved to New York in 1938, and she was immediately plunged into the New York art world, very different to the surrealist environment that she had been immersed in until then. Now, Bourgeois' first major retrospective exhibition took place in New York at the Museum of Modern Art in 1982, and she was immediately recognised as this elder stateswoman who represented an important body of feminist work. And it was really from that point on that she began to attract serious critical attention, and it was in 1999 that she made her first magisterial steel spider, the Mammon works you might be familiar with. But she was well into her 80s at that point, where international recognition suddenly came to her. In fact, Bourgeois had been working since the 1940s on her art practice, and has a very long and distinguished career well before her recognition in her 80s. A lot of the French surrealists that she had previously met and whose circles she had somewhat moved among in Paris had moved to New York. They were really escaping the war, and it was over the 40s that a number of artists, including André Breton, founder of the Surrealist movement, and others such as Max Ernst, began to settle in New York. Now, she'd had a very difficult relationship with the Surrealists in Paris. They were not welcoming of women artists. They were a very misogynistic group who tended to see women as more of a muse than a agent, as a serious artist. They were the subject, the object of their work. They were not necessarily considered a contemporary or a peer, something Bourgeois had no time for at all. And we see perhaps what we might think of as an early feminism beginning to emerge even in the 40s with Bourgeois' Femme Maison series. Now, Femme Maison, Woman House, recalls an earlier game by the Surrealists called Exquisite Corpse. Now, you might know this game. It's quite old-fashioned. It's where you get a piece of paper and you fold it into various lengths, and on each part somebody draws a part of a body, folds it over and hands it to the next person, who draws the next part without seeing the previous. Once it's gone around the group, you open up the concertinaed sheet and you have a strange hybrid, usually quite monstrous form. Now, she's taken this idea of playing with chance, but at the same time maintains a series of very, very particular motifs which we see over again in her practice. And what it includes is a naked female form from the waist down who carries about herself, almost like a tortoise, an architectural structure, a house. And there's this idea of the house standing in for the head, which is, the site of our sense of self, of our unconscious, as though she's either trapped or she carries the house like a burden, or perhaps it's a reference to her status as a subject in exile, which was how she found herself. She very much missed her family and friends that she had left behind in France, particularly when she arrived in New York. And these have been discussed, perhaps the one on the right where we see the sort of skyscraper-like form, as perhaps a comment on her new life in New York, as though a tortoise carrying her world about her person. She was very focused as well on the realm of the domestic. She had children, they had a family, her and Goldwater, and how hard it was for women to forge a career for themselves as an artist, at the same time being expected to manage the household and to be a good wife and a good mother. And for many women artists in this period and later, this weighed on their shoulders. It was very difficult. Women artists had very little standing in the art world, and at this time she's really striking out alone. And perhaps we might see some of that in these lonely images of the predicament of the woman artist and the mother. We can also understand these works as something of a feminine or a feminist response to the surrealist misogyny of the mannequin or the female dummy, which a number of surrealist artists were very interested in exploring. And I'm showing you a classic example here by André Masson, the mannequin, where you see the female form has been silenced by a pansy and caged, literally, as though a trapped bird. There's something very disquieting about this idea of the female body, which I think we see here a classic instance of the surrealist treatment of the female body as an object, as an inanimate object, as a subject with which they can do what they wish. And that's very different to the way in which perhaps Bourgeois was imagining her own trapped self. Shortly after this, Bourgeois abandons painting completely, and she moves into the sculpture, for which she's perhaps best known now. And she made what she called her personages. They were abstract substitutions for people. She discussed them in very thoughtful ways. She said they were almost a form of mourning for her. Each of these wooden carved forms, and you'll see they variously balance precariously on their tip, or they sit quite firmly on their shallow base. And these were clustered together in a kind of environment or an installation. These were meant to be seen as a group. And for Bourgeois, the personages were an abstract remembering, a form of melancholic recalling of those people she had left behind in Paris. Her first installation was 17 of these forms, these slender posts and planks of balsa wood. Again, they do evoke the surrealist figure at this time, particularly those of Giacometti, but they do something very different, which for Bourgeois was a form of enabling her through making them to somehow come to terms with that sense of loss that she felt. But at the same time, they do betray her commitment to a surrealist form of vocabulary, with its commitment to a so-called primitive set of forms as a kind of set of fetish objects. And these forms are variously punctured with nails, rough edges, the ways in which she's nailed and hammered them together. And a number, and you'll see in particular here the breasted woman, you see a maternal figure is evoked here with the that repetition of forms. This is a form of repetition very different to, say, Sol LeWitt's modular structure or Carl André's laying of one brick after the other. Bourgeois' repetition, there's a lot of difference in the way in which she's made this drawing to the left, these bulbous forms, and even in the sculpture itself, the repetition is not of a cube or a grid or a square, but of breasts, according to her title here, that this is supposed to be a maternal figure, perhaps a substitute for herself. She often would identify these forms with individuals. Another example, a very well-known one, is her portrait of C.Y. This is a 5.5 foot high square post that's been painted white. So this stands and sort of addresses the viewer roughly at face height. So it appears precariously balanced. If you look, it comes to a sloping point just at the bottom. And this is quite an aggressive object. It's like a fetish, but it's also a doll. And this idea of hammering, if you look at the centre, there's a cluster of nails that she's hammered into the form. And these are often photographed in very harsh light, so a strong shadow is cast, making sure those nails are very, very visible. Now, this language of physical manipulation and aggression is key to understanding Bourgeois' work. She was interested in exploring her own experience as a mother, but as a frustrated mother who was having to handle the demands of the home and her children, at the same time her own desire to make art. And rather than separate the two, she would explore those sense of ambivalence and aggression that she would feel, and she would channel them into her works of art. Now, what's important to know about Bourgeois is she was incredibly well read. She was a very, very intellectual artist, and she was fascinated in reading psychoanalysis, and particularly the psychoanalytic writings of Melanie Klein, who specialised in thinking about the unconscious development of the very young infant. And Klein's most controversial and most well-known claims are that the infant, the baby, from the moment it enters the world, is every bit as charged with desire and aggression and ambivalence as the more mature subject. Freud and his followers were shocked that Klein would project such language of desire and aggression onto the small infant, but Klein, through play sessions with young disturbed children she would work with, was adamant that what you would see in the ways in which children play with hammers and bricks and the language they use of destruction and violence was absolutely an external projection of their internal unconscious. And there's something of wanting to express her own internal rage and aggression that has been discussed by art historians, including Mignon Nixon, as manifest in these works. Into the 1960s, Bourgeois begins to experiment with new materials. In particular, we see these plaster moulded forms, some more abstract than others, as well as a shift into using latex, a new rubberized material that could really be manipulated and pushed and pressed into very, very different shapes when soft. The same, of course, is true for plaster. When it's still moist, it can be pressed and moulded and manipulated by hand, and you see evidence of Bourgeois' handprints all over figure and clutching, which is a kind of abstract rendering, perhaps of clutching hands or roiling curls of snakes. She also made at this time her fée couturière, the fairy dressmaker, and this is suspended from a hook in the ceiling, which is a very unusual and perhaps quite aggressive thing to do to a sculpture. Makes us think of slabs of meat, perhaps. And it's a plaster form into which she's made small cavities into which we can peer. It's like a nest or a body that's sagging to the floor. And this has been described by art historians as very much an abstract erotic rendering of the body. The idea of cavities, membranes, secrecy, and the interiority that we can just about see as we tiptoe to peer into this strange nest that hangs just above our heads. At the same time, she's working with latex as well as rubber here, and we see again that soft landscape from 1963 that we looked at the beginning of the lecture, and another work called Double Negative, where we see again her use of repetition, except again these are not standard geometric forms, but rather phallic, strange, mushrooming objects that seem to be poking up from the amorphous, messy underside of the work, which Bourgeois, very typically for her, lets us see. And so what looks like we're seeing the top and the bottom of a work, and perhaps the bottom part is the unfinished aspect we shouldn't see, but Bourgeois is always happy for us to see the perhaps less finished, less processed side of her working practice. The same with soft landscape, which looks like solidified lava, as though this is suddenly frozen between soft and hard. It looks like it's a plug that's been tugged from the very core of the earth. Here we're looking at a very well-known work by Louise Bourgeois, Le Regard, The Gaze, from 1966. This is a work that's made from latex. It's poured into a mould, and she added coloured pigment to this to give it this fleshy tone. And this is a work that Lucy Lippard described in relation to eccentric abstraction as indirectly erotic. And you might want to think about this idea of the indirectly erotic. What does that mean? What is Lippard trying to get at? What isn't she saying when she uses that term here? And I think what's quite clear looking at a work like Le Regard is that we can understand this, and it has been written about by critics, as anything from a squashed pie to a blind eye, to a vagina, to an anus, to a mouth, various different bodily associations, as though this is a part of the object ripped from the body and somehow made to signify all on its own. It's deliberately unsettling. By calling it le regard, the gaze, there's a suggestion that this work looks at us, it stares back and draws us in. Other very well-known works by Bourgeois is her Fillette from 1968, and a very famous photograph of Louise Bourgeois clasping that sculpture under her arm, and she's photographed here by Robert Mapplethorpe. And what she's done is take this clearly phallic form, which again is suspended from the ceiling, and she has tucked it underneath her arm in a gesture of maternal care, as though she's looking after this form. Here's another hanging work, Janus Fleury, which again is somewhere between phallic and vaginal. It looks like a wound, it looks like the insides of a work that's somehow split open. And this is the ambivalence and the play between binaries that Bourgeois made a key aspect of her practice. The idea that the gender is uncertain. This is a malleable form that speaks more to our unconscious sense of being than describing a particular body or person in the world. I want to move on to an artist now who may be known to you, Yayoi Kusama, who is a Japanese artist who came to America in the late 1950s, absolutely determined to make it as an artist. She was very competitive, very ambitious, very determined, but she was at the same time an artist absolutely challenged by a very difficult mental health. She would have frequent bouts of what she described as breakdown, where she describes her sense of self, her sense of bodily borders breaking apart and coming down. And she says that she imagined nets or polka dots suddenly filling the visual field, and she felt herself dissolving and becoming one with her environment. And you see in this slide a very powerful use of photography to somehow capture that experience as a work of art. You see this is a double exposed photograph of her in front of one of her infinity net paintings, and you see her at work in one of these massive monochrome works, and she says by painting these she was able to calm herself down. And there's an obsessive form of repeating the same looping net, she calls them nets, looping as she paints these curls of thick paint over and over and over the canvas. They helped her, she said, ease her anxieties. She's well known now for her spectacular room environments, where again she tries to disorient us, to provide for us a kind of experience that is akin to those that she continues as a much older artist now to experience, to somehow make us part of what she calls Kusama's world. And here we see a room filled with tiny spotlights, another neon ultraviolet light in an ordinary domestic setting, which is really confusing when you walk in because it does appear to flatten, and then one filled with these inflated polka dot balls. Before she moved into these room environments, she was working with soft fabric, and these are works that she's well known for too. These are two early wall reliefs, so by that we mean it's a sculptural form, but it's mounted on the wall, so it's not quite fully 3 dimensions. And again, she's using that form we saw in the armchair, where she's getting fabric and she's stuffing it with sort of cushion filling, stitching them closed, and then stapling them to the board, which has been covered in the same stripy or spotty fabric, to produce these kind of protuberant, strange sculptural forms that somehow exceed their limits. She would also cover other domestic items, calling them her accumulation furniture. So we've got a pantry to the right, a baby carriage to the left, and above that, armchair. And the immediate question raised, of course, is what am I supposed to do with this? Do I sit on it? Is this useful? What's she done to the ordinary and familiar domestic object? Well, what she's done is made it unfamiliar, somehow even threatening. This is no longer in the realm of the everyday, but is doing something completely different. Perhaps it's another suggestion of railing against the containment of the domestic sphere, as we see with Bourgeois' Femme Maison series. And of course, these forms, she called them phallic, and she said she was terrified of sex, and the one way that she had of managing this was to make these phallic forms over and over and over again. And I think there's a certain amount of irony involved in that, but nonetheless, she wants to remind us that these abstract, sausage-like forms are, of course, incredibly phallic in one reading. And here she is displaying a kind of mastery over her phallic field with an early room installation from 1965 where she wears red leotards to somehow blur with her environment. Now, this is a small mirrored room covered with giant soft stuffed forms, which she performs very eloquently for the camera. Here she is instead lying among the forms, and she was a very canny self-promoter, and she understood the power of posing herself, in particular herself as a young Japanese woman who immediately created quite a stir in the art world. And this was something that she would often deliberately play up to, and in order to orientalize herself, she would deliberately wear kimonos and arrive at openings in a very, very particular manner. And this was a way in which she began to assert her difference to the male-dominated world at that time in which she was moving, which was absolutely run by white men. And for this young woman to come in and make works like no one had seen before was a really powerful move. She would also deliberately play up the erotics of her works, again using photography to the left here, where she wears heavy makeup and lies in a provocative manner among this photo of her again inside Infinity Mirror Room. And then to the side we see her holding another of her domestic items, a cut-out shape of a dress, which is covered with these forms, again making the ordinary completely extraordinary. In another photographic shot of her in her studio here in her loft, you can see that what she's done is taken one of those floor panels from Infinity Mirror Room and she's leaned it against the wall and she's pressing her body against it as if trying to become one with the form. And you'll notice she's wearing fishnet stockings, which she does quite often because they have that net-like patterning which recalls her infinity net paintings, and this attempt to somehow render her body as one, as absolutely of a piece with her sculptural work. She does it again with my flower bed, which was made from an old mattress which is cut up and dyed. And the coils of the springs you see are what she rests on. She pretends to sleep here on the floor, and above her looms this triffid-like terrifying plant form, which is made up of hundreds and hundreds of gloves that she's dip-dyed red and stuffed. And so this idea of hands as plants, as reaching for her, somehow devouring her body, is again another motif that she would frequently use, the idea that these stuffed soft forms are not only protecting her but somehow devouring these phallic forms. And this of course is a long way from the perfect serial arrangement of identical units. Instead we see this sort of tumbling riot of tumescent forms, and these protuberances are at once so bodily and at the same time so clearly not of the body. And I think there's something witty and playful to these eccentric forms that sits somewhere between erotic objects and funny playthings. And just another couple of examples of her mirrored rooms. This was a small hexagon-shaped room she made in 1966, where, like Bourgeois' fait couturier, you can only peep in to its interior, which is like a massive kaleidoscope. And here she poses inside as if performing that sense of disorientation with her own body at the centre right here. And while you were in this, it was a very loud, cacophonous installation, and the Beatles song Help played on loop really loudly the whole time you experienced this work. So it's a real kind of pop art like moment for Kusama, but at the same time it's an attempt to capture some of the sense of dread and anxiety that really was a mainstay of her practice. And I think we see that really quite clearly in this really astonishing photograph, where she has clustered together many of her own works into a small space in her loft, including her dressed in her coat and clutching 2 suitcases that have been covered, if you can see, in dried pasta, which was another material that she would use. You see that she stands with my flower bed looming over her, and these other relief forms and soft bulbous sculptures that seem to be coming out from the wall and almost enveloping her. I think there's something about her status as a feeling like an outsider artist here as well, that she sensed herself in a very different way to Louise Bourgeois, who leaves Paris for New York, but she's left her home in Japan for America. She always struggles with the English language. She never feels really at home within the New York art world, and there's this real sense of isolation and sense of always being on the move that I think is captured really powerfully in this work. And I think that as well as witty playthings, there's a sense of foreboding in these forms that threaten to overwhelm her, these abstract erotic bodily forms. Okay, I want to move on to our third artist now, and I hope you're starting to see some similar themes and a certain set of terms that it's beginning to emerge that we can use to describe and compare and contrast the works by Hesse, Bourgeois and Kusama, and to recognise a certain set of shared practices, although there's no sense that these 3 artists were ever working together or friends, but it demonstrates that in the New York art world at this time there were certain themes, materials, ways of working, and, as I said earlier, challenging the status quo that's articulated in each of their work. And here we have a wonderful photograph of Eva Hesse in her loft on the Bowery in New York. And she's blowing up a balloon, which she will shortly cover in wet papier-mâché. And then, once that's dried, she will carefully pop the balloon, remove it, and paint that sausage with a glossy black lacquered paint. And it will become one of her very distinctive abstract erotic phallic sculptural forms. To her side is a work called Ingeminate. Now this was made from papier-mâché, and the final forms were covered in string that she's bound really tightly around each of those fat sausagey forms and painted it again in that glossy paint. But I want you to notice 2 things. One is the way in which the rubber cables coming out of the end of the 2 forms spool into an overlong puddle at the base of the sculpture. She's done this deliberately. Of course, the cord is too long or the table is too short. We would expect this to fall in a rather more neat and linear way, but instead she likes the slight chaos of that tangle that sits at the floor. And you'll also, the second thing to notice is that this is a small part of her loft which she's painted white, and she's put a drop cloth on the floor. This is for photographic purposes. She's already imagining what her work will look like when it's installed in an art gallery, and it's a really wonderful display of how an artist works and thinks in their studio space. This is a small model for the large 3-part work we saw in the installation shot of Eccentric Abstraction, those 3 panels that were suspended on the wall in the back of that photograph, just to give you a sense of what I was describing earlier, where she takes these minimalist grid forms of the punctured masonite wall-bound boards, and then she completely disrupts the idea of the geometry of that grid by covering it with a tangle, a mess of wires that completely disrupt any sense of logic or order. And Eva Hesse was very close with many of the minimalist artists, and so really did understand her work in conversation with them. Here we see another work that employs themes of repetition, but you'll notice each of those latex buckets are slightly different to each other. She made this work a few times. You see this is version 3 because the others kept coming out too neat and uniform. She wanted them to be just a little off, just a bit wrong. And I think this is a wonderful example of an artist making and remaking their work, not to make it better, but to make it deliberately somehow a bit worse, a bit less stable. And these are always installed in a haphazard manner. There is no plan for this. This is about chance and the provisional placement of the work. And she's using fiberglass here. She's also very interested in latex, like Louise Bourgeois. And in particular, what she and Bourgeois shared was an excitement with what latex could do, the way it invoked the body and flesh in a very material, if abstract, ways. She also made a number of wall reliefs. If you think of that Kusama one from 1962 with those soft stuffed forms that were protruding from the wall, we see here Hesse playing with wall-mounted relief works that just like Kusama's soft forms protrude from the wall, which is not something we expect a painting to do. So here we have Tomorrow's Apples, which is a combination of paper mache and wire, that's stiff wire that's been covered in cotton string and then painted in different colours. And you see the shadow of those forms because they've been deliberately pulled away from the surface to be somehow unwieldy. And this projection into our space reminds us that we're looking at a physical form here. The next work is a very well-known one by her, Ring Around a Rosie from 1965, and I think this work, more than any other, really articulates that sense of the abstract erotic we've been talking about. We see here another example of Hesse's engagement with the minimalist form. This is one of her accession series of boxes, and she had these externally fabricated, much like many of her minimalist contemporaries were doing at this time, by local factories. And what she's done is she's had them make a geometric cube form for her, which has been punctured with rows of neat holes. She's then threaded lengths of silver grey rubber tubing through those holes, but not facing outwards, but inwards, to give the appearance of a rubbery, furry interior. So she's taken this classic minimalist form of the box, but she's used an almost female domestic activity of threading the rubber through to make this rather disquieting furry form, which in fact had to be remade because spectators, when this was exhibited, took the metaphoric invitation to touch, which I think is implicit here, but they took it to heart and clambered inside. This rubbery, hairy interior was too much for people to simply look at. This compulsion to touch, which I think is part of what Hesse is trying to encourage, is visceral here. This idea that the work of art invites our touch is evident again in Untitled or Not Yet, a collection of hanging weighted net bags that she's filled with crumpled balls of transparent cellophane. Again, the the uncertainty over what you're looking at seems to be the key motor driving our desire to use our hands to find out. This somehow exceeds our mere polite forms of standing and looking and thinking. We want to somehow reach out and touch these forms. And much like Hesse, and of course Bourgeois too, this play through repetition of bodily association is disrupted. Are they breasts? Are they testicular? If so, why are there not two? Why are there more than one? And she would play with this idea of confusing what we think we're looking at. And we see this also with several, these lacquered, shiny sausage forms which are hung simply from a nail in the wall. You'll notice they're not all black, they're not uniform. Hess has used various grades of pale grey through to black in this several work, which of course is a playful title, because rather than give us a precise specific number, several is a deliberately indeterminate number. And we have photographs of Hesse pressed against the wall, draped with these sausage forms that hang around her head and over her shoulders, and she sort of smiles as if in on the joke as she strokes these long phallic forms. And the same with Untitled again, where she's playing with those wrapped secret forms hidden within sacks that weigh down from the wall. And in Geminate, this is a closer look of the work that we previously saw, just so that you can see that rope suspended, the rubbery tubing suspended from the two forms, but then the lacquered rope that she's used to coil around those sausagey forms. And I wanted you to see this photograph because you see, depending on the height of the pedestal, that rubber tubing falls and puddles and pulls in different ways. This is a work that is simply placed rather than installed. It seems it could almost have just been left there for a moment or placed there. This could look very different in a different form. And again, another photograph, which I'm sure you can find if you look online, of Hesse with that rubber tubing around her neck. And she holds the two forms, one in each hand, as if weighing up her sort of phallic prizes. Again, lends weight to this witty, subversive play with what we're looking at versus what we think we might be looking at, between the abstract and erotic. Here's a really important installation shot, again in her Bowery loft, where you see she's painted the floor white to get a sense of the works installed. But what's really important for me here is the extent to which this offers almost a vocabulary of Hesse's practice at this time. We see everything from the drooping, pinned, propped, provisional, soft, weighted, hard-edged versus soft forms. This is the vocabulary that not only Hesse is working out at this time with her sculptural forms, but which Kusama and Bourgeois are also at this time playing with. And this deliberate resistance to perfection, to finish, to geometric certainty, to the idea that the work has a clear set of bounded edges which are identifiable. Look at Aeneid at the left there, which is a wall-mounted work, the string of which tangles and knots and hangs from the wall and has been draped across the corner. And also for me, that wonderful work in the middle, pinned to the wall like a giant donut. It's called Total Zero, and the donut form is deliberately bulbous and wonky. It's not a perfect circle. She wanted that sense of it having gone wrong to be kept in play. And there's a stiff coil of wire that protrudes rather rudely right from that form and pokes directly into our space. It's a kind of abstract way of pointing at us and drawing us into the work. Next to that photograph of Hesse here performing for the camera that absurdity of her abstract erotic form, we have the older artist Louise Bourgeois. What she's doing here is draping herself in this soft rubber mould for a series of some of her best known sculptures that were cast in bronze and also carved from marble in the late 60s. But instead, what she's done here is taken that soft discarded shell and she's insisting on its bodily sensations and evocations by literally embodying it, by wearing it as a kind of avant-garde fashion statement. And just to give you a sense of what that mould produces, here we have an example of that sculptural form. Here is a Venza on display. So to return by finishing with our first slide here, you see these objects, and we'll recall that we've looked at the work of 3 women artists, all of whom were working in New York at the tail end of a period best known for the production of large-scale abstract expressionist painting by Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko and others. These artists introduced new materials and ways of looking at and thinking about the object. They used soft forms, fabric. They produced unstable objects that were wholly unfamiliar. They used parts of the room not always used by painting or sculpture. They are sculptures taken off the usual pedestal or cabinet, and they're placed on the wall, or they're propped or draped across corners, or they sit flat and directly on the floor. All of these women artists moved from 2 to 3 dimensions in the 1960s. All were interestingly working before a formal feminist politics began to emerge in the New York art world in the late 60s and early 70s, and it's really that period we'll return to in our final lecture of the course. But yet clearly these are 3 artists absolutely committed to thinking about expressing something of their sense of subjectivity, of the body, that we might now think about as a form of early or proto-feminist practice, that working with the abstract erotic language of latex and fabric somehow provided them a brand new set of materials and forms of expression that were uniquely their own. We look to some of these themes in the next lecture, where we focus on the intersection of abstraction and sexuality in relation specifically to questions of violence and the kinds of abstract violent as well as abstract erotic approaches to making and thinking about sculpture, which came to the fore in another group of 1960s artists working in America. So this theme of abstraction, aggression and eroticism and their uncomfortable entanglement continue to be a key theme that we'll be thinking about, and I'll see you then.